over the rainbow.
Hey, story makers, and welcome to Tellwell, the podcast, where we're inviting you into the conversations that we get to have with our story makers or our clients and friends, the conversations that we get to have every day. With me in studio is one of my very favorite storytellers and very good friends, Duncan Williamson.
Hello. It's so nice to be here again for episode 2.
Episode 2, which means that we did the impossible of getting episode 1 out the door. Episode 2 is coming. I think it's Alex Hermosi, however you say his name, that talks about like, if you get 5 episodes out, you're in like the top 20% of all podcasts ever created. And if you get to like 20 podcasts, you're in like the top 1%. So we're on 2.
It's taken us a while to get here, but we're doing it.
Shooting for 20. So Duncan, as we introduce our guest today, Jenny Sheets, what I'm curious about is, what are some of your favorite brands?
Yeah. So brands is an interesting one for me because I feel like most people experience brands with like where their hobbies or their passions live. And so for me, there's like kind of 3 categories I'd put those into, right? Like number 1 is probably like film, photography, like the work we do, right? Mm-hmm. There's brands within that space that I get excited about. Number 2 is like the outdoor space. So what are the cool brands doing that are like mountain bike companies, or they're producing snowboards or whatever. And then the other one is racing, which is the other like big passion of mine. And I think you could consider it a brand, but it's a race team that competes in the sports car championship. IMSA, a little plug for them. They don't listen to this podcast, but they have this car. It's called Rexy. And so it's basically like a Porsche race car. And most people that watch like this stuff, it's like usually they don't take a lot of risks. It's a lot of company logos. It's a lot of like brand colors, and like the cars all look pretty similar. Chevy's always yellow and Ferrari's always red, and there's not a lot of fun happening. But there's a specific team that has Rexy, and they have created a brand around the front of the car looking like a dinosaur. It's painted like a T-Rex. And what I think is really neat about it is my nephew, Henry, he watches with his grandpa, and he has become a fan of this thing, which for most people is like a boring motorsport. It's like not necessarily the most exciting form of racing to watch. It's not F1, it's not glitz and glam, all that stuff. But now this like 4-year-old loves watching it with his grandpa because of Rexy. And so I think that's a cool example of how like a brand doesn't need to be like flashy. It doesn't need to be like high end. It's not necessarily like, it's Christian Dior or some like really like elevated thing that you aspire to. It can also be something that just is like fun and relatable and gets people excited to follow or watch or participate in whatever you're doing.
I love that Christian Dior was your example, when I don't think I've ever heard that brand like come out of your mouth.
No, exactly.
Remotely related to it. So our conversation with Jenny today is really going to be around how can brands create some of those experiences that make connections, and some of the unanticipated connections, and some of the happy little accidents that organizations and communities can make to really spark those moments of joy, spark those moments of connection, like Rexy does.
Like Rexy, yeah.
With your nephew.
Well, and I think Rexy's a fun example because it started as just like a thing, and they did it 1 year, and it wasn't, to my knowledge, they didn't have a huge like emphasis, or wasn't a super intentional thing. It was just a fun thing, and people absolutely loved it. And so it was that kind of like happy little accident where they sort of stumbled into this big like brand following or race team following. And it's built, and it's like now the most popular car in that series for so many people. They're selling t-shirts with it on it. They're doing all sorts of like fun artwork. And I believe that it actually supports a nonprofit around, I think like children's cancer research or something like that is now what they've been able to then turn it into as it's gotten a lot more notoriety.
I love that. Well, I know I'll be doing some Googling for Rexy, and until then, here's our conversation with Jenny Sheets. Welcome, Jenny Sheets, to Tellwell, the podcast. We're so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here.
So you had mentioned before we started, you were like, I might be nervous to be on a podcast, but you're like, we're hanging out in the Tellwell studio, someplace that you know already. You've already been talent here. How do you feel coming onto the podcast today?
I feel good. I feel a little bit more at ease. I think the blustery wind helped me a little bit, and it's fun to be in here again. Yeah. The studio is so professional, so you kind of walk in and feel like a celebrity right away.
Well, you are a celebrity. You are a celebrity. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Because I think one of the things that I love so much about the work that you do and the work that you've done since you came here is really around community building, right? But I want to jump back.
Okay.
I want to jump back to maybe even Jenny you can start wherever you want. This is your story.
From the block?
Well, Jenny, I'm absolutely going to insert that. But would love for you to start out. Who is Jenny for people that don't know?
Who am I? Well, let's see. I was born in Montana. So half my family were Montana people, and then grew up mostly in Fargo. So I was a Fargo kid, graduated from Fargo South, but then did the inevitable. I was like, I'm out of here. Hit the bricks. Never coming back.
See you later, alligator.
See you later, Fargo. But here I am. So you know how the story ends up. But spent half my life then in Bozeman, Montana. I studied public administration. So really I have done, I guess you're right, a lot of community building for many years. And then studied, English, philosophy, creative writing, so storytelling. And then had a baby during the pandemic, as you do, and came fleeing back to family. So we moved back, and my husband and I, and now we have a 3-year-old here, started working with startups at Emerging Prairie and did a lot of events and just got, more integrated into the Fargo community, and we're still here.
I love it. We're so glad you're still here. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. Why is community so important? I'll be honest, it makes a little bit more sense knowing that you came back to Fargo. I just thought you were an import, a straight up import versus this was a homecoming.
My roots are here. Yeah.
So it makes a little bit more sense, but you really did do a lot of community building out in Bozeman, Greater Montana. So where did that come from? Why?
That's a good question. I've actually been digging into this because my recent work has gotten more into placemaking and community building and those authentic connections. So I've had to do some soul searching of where is this coming from? And I think it goes all the way back to being a kid, and I would see kids that were left out or not getting involved, and I would try to reach out to them. It just was natural. And, I was not some sort of savior by any means. I think I just somehow felt guilt inside of me of nobody is playing with them. I have to play with them. And so I would bring them in. And then that kind of led to hosting. My parents were great hosts. They were art professors here in the community and would host these big art gatherings. So as a kid, I would see this and how much fun it was. So I started doing that as I got older and loved to host get-togethers where I'd bring in different groups of friends so that they could all meet each other. And you curate the group for good conversation. And for if somebody is going through a hard time in their life, maybe bring them in and invite this friend because you think they'll click. And then it just kind of got bigger into the community of, how can we impact business this way? How can we get people into the parks? How can we get people outside? How can we get people running into each other with those kind of intentional collisions? So it's stemmed from childhood, and I'm still doing it today. I love hosting. It's like throwing a big party for strangers.
So in that, you talked a little bit about this idea of placemaking. And I think placemaking for me has become this kind of scary academic word. But I think that you take a very, in Tellwell land, what we'd call a down-to-earth approach to placemaking. So can you just explain a little bit about what placemaking is and even some examples of where it might show up that people are just oh, there's a big group of people down there, but it's actually really intentional.
Yes, intentional. That's the word. You nailed it. So I just recently saw a phrase that I like, that placemaking is turning a space into a place. So how do we make it special? How do we make it the spot to be? And it's through intentional design. So that means, for example, there's a park here in town. I'm not going to name it. I don't want anybody to feel bad. But the park benches are facing the street, the busy street, as opposed to facing inward to invite conversation, have spectators, watching the kids play, talking over a chess game, things like that. The simplest of designs. It doesn't have to be a major event. Placemaking is, the word that I like to use is where can you get somebody to linger? That's what we want people to do, is to linger. I think of communities where they have front porches, where people hang out in their front yards. That's unfortunately, most of the US is not like that. But how do we create those places where you want to talk to your neighbor, where you run into somebody? Fargo's Broadway Square is amazing. That's a great example of placemaking. So Fargo's Broadway Square, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a southern square where there's, shops around. And if you're on foot, you're going to be walking through it. And what I like about it is that it's designed for those accidental and intentional collisions where you run in and, oh my gosh, Max, I haven't seen you in so long. How's it going? Oh, you're running to lunch? Well, let's try to grab a coffee next week. Where are those places in your community? And it can be small. It doesn't have to be a huge design by the city. It can be a little corner park. It can be a park bench. These little things that encourage people to talk to one another. That's placemaking.
Fantastic. And so that's some of the work that you're doing now in your consultancy.
Yes.
So can you tell us, how do you go about thinking about, how do you go about creating intentional collisions?
Ooh, it's case by case, but I still put on kind of my hosting cap. So I'll think, how do I make a really inviting, warm, welcoming space that is going to appeal to the extroverts, to the introverts, to different cultures, different ages, different demographics. It's hard. You don't win every time, but there are a couple components that I really like to think about with placemaking. One of them is something I learned that I never thought about is that people love to kind of do the walk by. Right? Like it's almost like if you're walking by, okay, put yourself back into college days, go way back, way back further. JK. And you're going to go to a house party. Yeah. You and your friends might kind of walk up, do a look, what do we think? What's the vibe? So you want to create a space where people can kind of do a pulse check. Do they feel comfortable? Do I have an easy out if it's kind of awkward and I need to leave? So that's why less gates, less ticketing, less, things that bring people in and welcome them in. So if you were to design a park, can people park on all sides? Can they do a drive-by to see how they feel about it? So those are kind of some of the things that I think about when creating this. And then who's your audience? Who are you? What's the goal of the event? What do we want? What's the duration? Is this supposed to go for an entire season or is it just a few hours? So all of these things that you take into consideration.
So those are fantastic. And I'd be curious if we could and I know it's on a case-by-case basis, but a lot of our listeners are going to be small business owners, nonprofits and causes. There are story makers. So for the story maker who's out there listening, and maybe they have an event coming up, maybe they're designing out a new office like we are.
Yes.
What are some tips, tricks, advice that you have for them to create place out of what might be an ordinary event for them or an ordinary space for them?
Yes. Oh, I love this. So first and foremost, it does not need to be expensive. I think that's everybody's biggest question when throwing an event or creating an experience or designing a space is, I don't have the budget for that. It can be small. In fact, I think a stellar event would be to go back to 90s themed slices of pizza on paper plates. Somebody's has cassette tapes, it can be so cheap as long as you kind of stick to a theme or a vibe, which is probably in line with your mission and values of your company or your business or whatever it is. What is the energy that you want to give? And then what do you want people to take away from that? So when they enter a space, if this is an event or an office, so if it's temporary or permanent, what's the first feeling that they're going to get? Do you have a heavy door that is intimidating? We'll put a sign on it that says, no need to knock, come on in. Or can you put a window in your door? Again, those are very different budgets. Do you have refreshments for people right away? People want something to do with their hands immediately. Do you have somebody at a front desk or not? What is the first feeling that people have? And then think of all the senses. So again, this can be really low cost. What do people see? What do they hear? What do they smell? What can they touch right away? And that does not need to be big, but And as you think of those senses, then think of user flow. So again, this is kind of applying technology, which I love, just the user experience and user interface, to real offline experiences of how do people move through your space? How do you create value? How do you keep them in there and keep them engaged? Anyone, if they're selling a product or service, can think of that both online and offline. And that's placemaking.
That's brilliant. There is a former Disney executive, I'm going to lose the name, but he goes through a step-by-step process to try to put yourself in the place of your audience and walk through it step by step and try to really empathize, to put yourself in their shoes. And I think one of the things that I've heard of some of your teams doing in the past is actually doing that and physically walking through
Absolutely.
that process as well.
Absolutely. You should go from, I mean, if you're bringing somebody into a physical space, you should have to get in your car or your bike or walk. How do they get to that spot? Literally, do they have to park 6 blocks away? And then are they going to show up at your door in a bad mood because of that? Well, then how can you fix that? How can you tell them, oh, it's going to take you only 6 minutes to walk? How do you make it not a big deal? Walk through that space and what do they need? And then where do they have questions? Where is there maybe a why in your design? They could go this way or that way. And do you want that? Is that your intention? Do you want them to have to make a choice or do you want to make the choices for them? So yeah, physically going through that experience, again, online or offline is very important.
So many like nuggets of gold so far.
Oh my gosh.
That are just like so helpful. Like make a checklist of your next event and like your senses, right?
Yes.
Walk through, do some of these little things to really elevate. And they're very practical too, right? I appreciate the like, have a window. If you can't have a window, have a sign.
Right.
Like you can print it out.
Yes. That is the thing, is that it doesn't have to be high cost. It doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need a massive team. You just need to be intentional. And really it's in the details. If you go through, put yourself in the mind of your user, it's going to be easy. It's really, people don't need a whole lot. They just want to be taken care of.
Oh, that is so true. The one visual that I had, maybe not visual, smell that I had was like, how do you make sure like Bob 3 cubicles down isn't stinking it up? And so as you talk about those like low cost options, just making sure Bob has deodorant that day or something.
This reminds me, did you ever watch The Office?
Yeah.
They had somebody important coming into the office. So Dwight, who sells beets and is not a very pleasant character, puts an entire plant in front of Phyllis because he doesn't want anybody to see Phyllis.
Oh, poor Phyllis.
Poor Phyllis. But that's maybe Bob. You have to put an air freshener next to Bob.
You know what? And the nice thing, the happy byproduct or the happy accident that happens from that is everybody has a better experience with Bob because...
And maybe Bob feels good about himself because he smells good.
Poor Bob.
Oh, everybody knows a Bob.
Everybody knows a Bob.
Maybe we're the Bobs sometime.
Oh, I definitely am, especially like after a long film shoot. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
It's true. So I'd love to jump into this idea of story. And so we use story here at Tellwell to help brands and causes connect with their various audiences, whether that be a customer, whether that be a donor. Story is really important to you. Creative writing is really important to you. You and I ran into each other at a party and you're like, I love story. And it was like shortly before we like really knew each other. So it was a really fun collision. And I was like, well, I love story too. Like, let's hang out. That type of energy around the love of story is not normal. And I mean that in the most loving of ways.
Agree.
I have the same love of story.
Yes, I know you do.
Why? Why story? What is it about story, the writing process, the telling process?
I love stories so much. I think it just goes back to, basic human nature. We resonate with stories. And so my mom was a great storyteller, for better or worse. She could just fabricate anything. I was actually just thinking prior to coming onto your show, if you ever get to meet my mom, like she is so good, you have to ask her about the time that they hired a roofer who was such a mess, but he was selling jewels out of his trunk and somehow conned my mom into buying these jewels. But the way she tells it, so I see you're writing this down. Talk to Paula about the jewels. And
literally Jenny's mom.
Yes.
Jewels. I gotta be careful how I write that. Okay.
But she taught me, if you can tell a story, then you are capturing someone's attention, and how fun to connect with somebody on that level. And so it goes to, from mom to daughter to company to, your customer to anyone. Research actually shows, so I used to be in fundraising, that people resonate with the story of the one more than the many. And, if you were to say there are, some of the examples in the research were very unpleasant and horrific of like, there are, 10 million starving children. That's awful. But unfortunately, people glaze over it more than if you learn about Jill. Jill is starving. Mm-hmm. Jill needs food. Then those stories really hit us because we feel like we can relate. We can see Jill. We know Jill. And so I've always been a storyteller. I've always read my whole life. I resonate with stories. I love stories. And they're at the base of everything that we know. Most of us don't know numbers and facts and statistics on the daily. That doesn't enter our brain and doesn't compute. However, we grew up with Cinderella and Pixar. And, my son is so into Toy Story now and he reads the Spot books. And so everything that I'm trying to teach him is also framed in a story because he gets it. He understands a story. We also like conclusions. We're very cathartic, right? We love to follow the hero's journey and we like a resolution. We like resolution in our own life. None of us like to leave things hanging. So those stories, I think that if you're applying that to business, to your mission, to your vision, nonprofits, that's what's going to resonate with your listeners and your audience.
Yeah. Have we talked about the hero's journey? You and I?
No, but let's talk about it.
Oh my God. I can go so nerdy. We actually have these giant, like 11 by 17. I'll send one home with you.
Please.
Like these maps that we use when we work with clients to walk them through their hero's journey. And it's always positioning yourself as the guide. So that way, whoever you're talking to can be the hero of their own story.
Yes.
Right. And
absolutely.
so as you think about fundraising, we talk a lot about this in fundraising. And just a side note, as you were talking about some of those examples, the one that I remember living through, the product that I lived through is I was at Starbucks. I was a coffee master at Starbucks.
Oh,
I
coffee master.
I was a coffee master. I believe I was the first Black apron in all of North Dakota, but I could be making that fact up.
Oh my
I doubt anybody that's
gosh.
listening to this
autograph?
is gonna fact check that. But what I remember is we had they're bottles of Ethos water, right? Ethos water is a Starbucks brand, and we had baskets of them right next to the ready to eat and drink little counter thing.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting is when we first launched that product, it had a big photo of an entire community.
Okay.
Nobody really cared, right?
Yeah.
It was oh, there are lots of little faces in there, and it was only 11 inches long, and so that you couldn't make anybody out.
Yeah.
And this really interesting thing happened. They did an experiment where about half the stores got new signage with just one face and one name.
There you
and
go.
And the rest had the big group photo. And the sales skyrocketed.
Wow.
Not double digit increases. And
Oh
when
my
you do that across that, it's wild. And so it's just one little example of how we don't even understand that, or maybe we don't consciously understand that we connect with that person one-on-one versus one-to-many.
Yep.
Which,
absolutely.
I mean, might also bubble up into some broader political things too, where we can connect with one, but we don't necessarily feel like we can connect with many.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, okay, not to get too political, but think about the garbage right now that you're either on this side or this side. What does that mean? You have to relate to 150, 200 million people and you're all the same. That we all know this is not truthful. This is not real life. But if you talk to your neighbor and you get to know Bob and you realize whatever, Bob's beliefs are, if your car gets stuck, Bob's gonna get you out, right? And here are the stories. Again, see, look what I'm doing. Yeah. I am giving your neighbor a name. I'm giving you now something to visualize. This is what we can resonate with, because then we can picture it in our own life. Your example, the water bottles, made me think of Jones Soda. Do you remember Jones Soda?
Absolutely.
They would have the photos on it of some, skateboarder or a concert or maybe just a flower, but then on it they'd have the name and the location of that person. And I remember in high school we would save those labels. So we were obsessive customers because we felt oh my gosh, Jane in Austin sent in a photo. Maybe I could send in a photo. And I wonder, oh my gosh, Jane's so lucky. And you just felt you connected to that brand. Absolutely. I loved it. I want a Jones Soda.
Fair enough. Do you remember the Coke campaign?
Which one?
The when they put the
names. Oh my gosh.
And people were just collecting them, especially people with a little bit weirder names.
Yeah.
If you saw your friend's name, I remember I had an old boss from my healthcare days, and I saw her name on a can, and I was like, oh,
you have to buy it.
Gotta get it.
You have to, yes, because we relate to each other into those stories.
It's true. So I'd be curious how you've seen the power of story used for good in building communities, growing nonprofits, growing causes. How have you seen that? Do you have any fun examples that you can think of?
Actually, I have a great example, one that has caught me off guard, or I think caught all of us off guard, but you know it, Yeti. Yeti's storytelling and branding. I mean, who knew that a cooler company would take over the outdoor industry? I think they nailed it. So I lived in Montana for most of my adult life. And Yeti is everywhere. And I remember when they started to come on the rise, their photos would show, these aspirational scenes of people camping, fishing, but they looked like you and I, like, oh, they're out there doing it. I can be out there doing it. And pretty soon people are wearing Yeti hats, Yeti t-shirts. And I remember my husband coming home one day and going, since when did coolers become cool? I don't understand what happened, but their branding was brilliant. That this storytelling then started to make this movement in the community of, being outside and being with your friends and having trustworthy equipment and things that you could rely on. I mean, similar in the outdoor industry, Patagonia, they have done storytelling for good.
Absolutely.
Of their, not only are they donating a lot of their proceeds to environmental causes, but the stories that they're telling are of individuals and groups and nonprofits that are making a difference for outdoor recreation, for accessibility, for environmental purposes. So a lot of people, they use stories. So they're, even if it's just through a photograph, right? Or a short video, you might not be able to quickly articulate what the story exactly is, but you get a feeling, you feel cathartic. There's resolution there. You feel relatable. And that's a story.
Yeah. I love both of those examples and both of those brands because they also do a really brilliant job of long form storytelling as well.
Yes.
Both organizations hire documentarians to create full length feature documentaries. There was one a few years ago that we screened at Fargo Docs, our documentary film series, called Unbranded.
Yes,
And
I
it's
remember that. Yeah.
It's this really, really incredible piece where you wouldn't think it has anything to do with this brand, but what they're doing is they go from the southern border of the United States to the northern border. They go to Mexico to Canada, and they want to prove that you can do it all on publicly accessible land.
Mhm.
What's fascinating, what the hell does that have to do with a cooler brand? It was a Yeti. It was not produced by Yeti, but like sponsored by Yeti.
Yeah.
And like, how cool is that? And really what they were doing was they were just continuing to like re-emphasize that like they are the guide. They are a helpful piece that allows these ranchers, these true cowboys to like make this journey.
Yes.
And we're going to support them not just by like having great products, but by actually like putting our money where our mouth is and like sending them on this trip
Yes.
too.
And it's part of their values. So that's, when we talk about even placemaking of like making sure that your values come through in whatever you're doing. So if you're hosting an event or making a commercial or doing an ad, can somebody say, I know what the values are? Like Coca-Cola, love it or hate it, right? Huge, mega corporate. But I bet anybody, like any kid, could identify their values. It's welcoming, it's inviting, it's fun, it's family, right? That's coming through in their marketing. So Yeti does that too. And they've got a larger budget now to do these full-length films, but they still, no matter what they're doing, what their values are. So you can probably articulate those.
So as we talk about values a little bit, you love the outdoors. You are an outdoor enthusiast.
Yes.
As we were chatting about what to talk about, I think like 4 of the 5 things were like nature, outdoor recreation, trail running, mountain biking. Like it was all those things. So being somebody who spent most of their adult life in the hills, mountains of Montana to the very unhilly version of
Unhilly. Hills removed.
the diet hills of Fargo and the Red River Valley. How do you share that story? How do you share the story of like encouraging people to get out and do outdoor recreation, even though it's going to look a little bit different? And maybe how do you do it too?
Well, that's a great question. It was a challenge at first to come home. I call Fargo home. I have several homes, but to move from Montana, where we were outside every day, just going to hike a mountain was normal Saturday morning activity before you run errands. But coming here, I had to work a lot harder to find it. I had to work a lot harder to find people to do this with me and to get outside. So the story that I think I've told is, actually, I don't even have to tell the story. Like the story is there. People want it. They really do. Like there's something cool and inviting about outdoor culture, but also intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it actually quite easy to talk to people in Fargo of, do you want to go for a hike? And their eyes light up like, oh my God, I've been waiting my whole life for somebody to ask me to go on a hike, but I don't know how, or I don't know where to go, or do I have the right clothes? Do I have the right shoes? So I found like, I guess my role is, and there's a lot of people here who are outdoor enthusiasts. Our role is to just encourage and show people that it's not that hard. And so the story's been that it's here. Here's just like baby ways to get into it. And again, the hero's journey, right? Making people feel like you can do this. Here are just some tools to get you there. So it's been actually fun finding the little secret outdoor spots in Fargo.
I appreciate that so much. I love what you said about making it slightly more accessible too. And have you heard of the movement Unlikely Hikers?
No.
So it's this really incredible movement where this woman was who is a bigger person, would go hiking with friends.
Was this with REI?
I think it was adopted by REI.
Okay.
I think it was like she made it a movement before, and then I think it's been brought in. There's another one for mountain biking called All Bodies on Bikes.
Very cool.
But it's really where they're starting to create gear specifically for, frankly, us bigger people, because the outdoor brands have not always been inclusive.
No.
They're actually, in general, the outdoor brands are not inclusive.
No.
Right? Because they're made for a specific type of person. So I love that idea of just like inviting people and inviting people into that story, because it is really intimidating the first time.
It is. Well, and it's, if you don't look a certain way, if you frankly, if you don't look like some of the ads that we've been talking about, do you feel welcome? Also, there's a cost barrier. I know I did a workshop last year on gear, and people, the biggest question was, well, how much are hiking boots and how much is a backpack and all of this? I said, oh my God, go to the thrift store. It does not need to be anything fancy. The biggest thing is to just get outside and just give it a shot. But that can be scary, but just try. And luckily, Fargo, you're not going to hit a grizzly bear. You're not going to end up lost on top of a mountain. You just go down to the river, walk along some trails. So you don't need any fancy gear for that.
Do you have any favorite trails in Fargo-Moorhead?
I do. I love MB Johnson Park over in Moorhead. It's just, it's so beautiful. We live near Gooseberry. So those are actually some sanctuaries that, albeit small, they are just an area where you can get into the trees and you don't see any other cars, houses. You're just in there by the water. There's some really beautiful spots. Just a little further away, Buffalo State Park, only like a half hour. And it's gorgeous. You get a mix of the plains and the trees, the river. It's awesome.
Stunning. So as we kind of, I guess, like on our way to wrapping up, I want to talk a little bit about like Jenny and like, where is Jenny going? You have a new consultancy that you started up within the last year or so. Mm-hmm. You're doing some cool stuff. What are you working on that you can talk about, I guess? And how do people engage with you?
So in October of 2023, I founded Discover Outdoors. I honestly had no clue what it was going to be. Still really don't. So it's been, 7-8 months now. It started out with a passion for the outdoors, of how do we get more people outside? I think mostly because I needed friends outside. So I thought, here's a very formal way for me to make friends. But since then, it's kind of evolved into this placemaking and community building. So I'm working on projects I've worked with the city of Moorhead. I'm working with a couple companies, working with a university here on how do we build community. And again, the word I think I mentioned earlier is linger. How do we get people to linger? And some of that's online, but largely it's offline, of how do we do that in person, face to face, and ideally outside. So if you want to reach me, I actually have a little website project. Don't make fun of me because it's just a baby website, but it's called getoutnorth.com. And you can contact me through there. It's what I'm trying to do is create a database of outdoor recreation, specifically with around a radius of the Fargo-Moorhead community. So if you're listening somewhere else on the coasts or down south, maybe we'll get there one day, but you have to come to visit in Fargo. Come to the Tellwell studio. This is your headquarters, right? And then we'll go for a hike or a bike outside of here. So that's just kind of the initiative that I'm working on, is how do we bring people together, loving the outdoors, talking to our neighbors, all through that.
I love it. So as you talk about really creating a community, inviting people in, a story that I've heard is that you invited some women to skateboard.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell me about this?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's been amazing. So, okay, let's go back a little bit. I tried to skateboard in college. Just, it was like the 2000s. I feel like we all got on a board. It was pop punk was huge. Quickly abandoned that. And then I had a baby during the pandemic, like I mentioned. Moved to Fargo, lost all of the activities that I did in the mountains. I was like, what the hell do I do now? Somehow somebody convinced me to get back on a skateboard. I could barely roll. I was like, oh my God, this is it. I'm almost 40. I've got a baby. I live in Fargo. Why the heck not? I'm skateboarding. So started skateboarding. I'm still very much a beginner. And joined the North Dakota Skateboarding Association board. So as
We
a
have a skateboarding association?
You betcha we
You
do.
betcha.
And I kind of represent the beginner, the person on the outliers of the skateboarding community. But we started a women's group because we were finding that more women were wanting to skateboard. So just started promoting to, if you're a woman and you identify as female, come on in. We want you. And it's been growing. It's amazing. So we've got some experienced skateboarders, some very brand new. We've had young girls all the way up to, I think our oldest was 48, maybe even older. It's super welcoming for anybody. So if you're out there, come join me.
I love it. As we kind of start to wrap up, probably last real question, but you've lived what feels like a really cool, storied life so far, right? From starting in Fargo to living your adult life in Montana to coming back to creating this community around outdoorness and then turning that passion into now a career and into a business. As you think through all of those lived experiences, as you think about the people around you, what are you grateful for?
That's such a great question. Moving back and having a new baby, as any parent can imagine, is sometimes you lose sight of what you're grateful for. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm here. It's cold. I've got this screaming kid. But then you just have these moments to pause and now and go, oh my God, there are so many amazing people in my life and so many amazing places. I think right now what I'm grateful for is the opportunity to pause because Fargo has a really comfortable way of life to it where it's okay to just be who you are here. And I really like that about this community where if you want to build a business, awesome. Here are some resources, build that business. If you want to just watch football on Sunday, great. I'll come bring some beer over. It is just a welcoming community. So I'm really grateful for that right now. I'm grateful for the health of my family. I'm grateful that we've got extended family to help out with me being this parent that's still fumbling along and grateful that I get to start this business that I'm still kind of figuring out and growing every day and have people like Tellwell, you guys here and friends in the community that are supportive of it. And there's still outdoor recreation in Fargo. Even though people say there might not be, I challenge you. It is still here.
I challenge that all day.
Yeah. So I'm grateful for a lot. I'm having a blast.
Love it. Jenny Sheets, thanks so much for joining us on Tellwell the podcast.
Thank you.
We're grateful you're here. We're grateful you're a part of this community and excited to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Hey, Storymakers, thanks for listening to Tellwell the podcast. We're so excited that you tuned in for this episode. If you found this episode helpful, if you got any nuggets of wisdom from it, we'd love for you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify because that's how this message gets out. If you're interested in having Tellwell help you share your story, just reach out to us at wetellwell.com or reach out in the comments. We'll make sure that we're listening and we will reach back out. On behalf of my co-host Duncan Williamson and myself, thanks so much for being a story maker and keep sharing your stories.
If we hold tight, we can chase the Mississippi through the night. Hundreds of miles